Okay, it is 8:30, so we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome all. Thanks for joining us for the 5th annual Greater Seacoast Housing Summit. So this event is a solutions-oriented panel discussion hosted by the Seacoast Chamber Alliance and us, the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast, and the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. Thank you to our partners for helping us put this event together, and of course to our presenting sponsor, Cambridge Trust. I'd like to start by turning things over to Dan Morrison, who's the president and CEO of Cambridge Trust, to share a few words.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Morrison, CEO of Cambridge Trust, New Hampshire. Cambridge Trust is proud to be a longtime supporter of the Workforce Housing Coalition. As Sarah said, this is the 5th annual Housing Summit, and we have been here as presenting sponsor all 5 years. We're very happy to continue to do that. 2020 has been a crazy year for all of us. We've all had to learn new ways of doing things. A year ago, how many of us even knew what a Zoom meeting was? Now it's what we do every day. Throughout 2020, Cambridge Trust has remained open. We've been serving our clients. We've been doing more lending this year than ever before. Earlier this year, when the pandemic broke out, we dove deeply into the Paycheck Protection Program. In just a few weeks last spring, we made hundreds of PPP loans and helped our small business clients to save an estimated 20,000 jobs that were in jeopardy. This year, we also stepped up and greatly increased our charitable giving, with the focus in 2 areas, first being public health and the economic crisis, and 2, racial justice and equality. Again, we're proud to be here in support of the Housing Summit, and I'm looking forward to this morning's program. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to everyone at Cambridge Trust for your support and work over the many years. My name is Sarah Wrightsman. I am the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast and the Housing Coordinator for the Regional Economic Development Center. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion, and I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. We are joined by Ryan Hvizda, Realtor and co-owner of the Hvizda Realty Group with Keller Williams Realty. Throughout the last 6 years as a real estate professional, Ryan has become a top agent in New Hampshire, leading the Hvizda Realty Group to be ranked by Wall Street Journal Real Trends as one of the top 10 real estate groups in the state. Ryan is a champion for housing affordability, and her passion for community comes from her extensive experience in farming, permaculture, visual arts, education, and community organizing. Ryan is the current chair of the New Hampshire Association of Realtors Sustainability Working Group, has served on the advocacy committees of New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility, and also Stay Work Play, Creative Concord, and public art committees within the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce. She is an active member of the Junior Service League of Concord and the secretary on the board of directors of In Town Concord. Ryan is also the co-owner of Bonafide Green Goods in Concord, New Hampshire, and the founder of the Zero Waste New Hampshire Facebook group, which has just surpassed 1,000 members. We also have Matt Sullivan with us this morning. Matt is recently the planning department manager at the city of Nashua, New Hampshire. Before that was the director of planning and development for the town of Wolfeboro. If you found out about this event from the Facebook page or the flyers, you'll see that he was listed as the town of Wolfeboro. So this is a very recent change. Prior to that, Matt was a senior planner at the Strafford Regional Planning Commission and the planner for the town of Northwood. Matt has a bachelor's degree in political science with a focus on urban planning, and formerly sat on the board of directors for our organization, the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast, and the Wentworth Economic Development Corporation. And finally, we're joined by Wilis Griffith. Wilis is a state representative for Manchester's 11th Ward and a champion for housing policy in the New Hampshire House. This week, Wilis was re-elected to his 2nd term in the House. Last year, Wilis was a member of the Governor's Task Force on Housing, which resulted in 2 bills sponsored by Representative Griffith along with Representative Joe Alexander of Goffstown. HB 1629 and 1632 were sadly lost in the pandemic, but we're going to talk more about the future of these initiatives today. Wilis has a master's degree in public policy from the Kersey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. So we're going to start with some moderated questions. We have some questions to kick off this event, but really this is an opportunity for you to ask our panel questions, and we'd love to tackle all of your burning questions. If you're tuning in on the web, please drop your questions in the Q&A on the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. For those of you who are joining us from Facebook, someone is monitoring the comments over there, so please put your questions for all or any of our panelists there. Ryan, I'm going to start with you. The theme for this year's summit, The Future of Housing, was originally, before the coronavirus pandemic, a response to the headlines about millennials and housing. Tell us what you see as a realtor. Are buying preferences among younger people really that much different than the older generation?
I would say that for some reason we're pigeonholing millennials to like want tiny houses, but their needs are just as diverse as where they're at in life. So, I mean, any day of the week, I'll have a millennial come to me saying they want to build wealth through real estate and they want to focus on their first purchase being a multifamily. Then the next day I'll have another one come and say, I want privacy and I want to be able to go out and grow my own food, or I want, the next day it could be somebody that wants walkable. And then there's also the affordability issue. So it will just be, we're shopping for a price point and we just need to make sure we can find a house that we can afford. So I wouldn't say it's the same, because a lot of the older generation is actually looking to downsize. They have bigger houses. They're looking for single floor living. They're definitely looking for walkability, and they're fighting over the same price point. But I wouldn't say that we could say all millennials want X. Like, it's very diverse. Like, I just had a couple from Boston that owns a condo in Boston, and they're building a second home in New Hampshire, 3,000 square foot home for a second home, and they're in their early 30s. So the range of what they want is so diverse. So I think we have to stop pigeonholing them in, they want 200 square feet in a community together, because it's just, sure, there are people that want that, but it's not everybody.
Yeah. How much of sort of preferences is actual, like truly a preference versus a lack of buying power? So there's a lot of talk that, you know, millennials want something that's smaller, and maybe part of that is preference, but how much of that is we can afford smaller places?
I think you hit that question hits it right on hits it right. Like, it is about what they can afford. So most, I'd say, first-time home buyers are under $300,000, and they're just looking, they'll say, I want to live here, and then they realize they have to go 20, 30 minutes outside of where they want to live to actually get affordability. And then you look in Rockingham County, they're not going to find anything. Maybe they'll find a condo. Same with Hillsborough County, because the median sales price there in Rockingham has jumped up to $471. So there's just not even an option to live in that county at all if you want a single family.
Yeah, that's so true. Speaking of that data, so one of the things that we did drop in the chat for all of our attendees today is New Hampshire Housing's October 2020 housing market report. So if you do want to check out that data that Ryan is alluding to, then you can see all of that in there. Matt, this next question is for you. One of the interesting things about your experience, and why I love talking to you about housing, is that you've worked in some very different communities. So you're in Nashua now, you've been on the planning board in Dover for a number of years, plus your experience in Wolfeboro, Northwood, and any other communities that you worked with through the SRPC. So what are the biggest challenges that are facing New Hampshire communities in regard to developing housing that's affordable to members of the workforce?
Well, Sarah, thank you for the question, first of all. And I guess thank you for the polite way of saying that I've gotten around the state a bit in my professional career. But to your point, I've had the opportunity to review and work with really a diverse set of communities and see how the housing market and how housing affordability has worked in each of them. Certainly looking at a community like the city of Nashua versus a more affluent and rural community like the town of Wolfeboro, very different housing preferences and certainly different community feel around the issue of housing affordability and how we talk about it. But I think when we look at housing affordability, there are two sort of common threads throughout all New Hampshire communities that I think we need to keep in mind. And I think they sort of shed some light on how we handle the issue moving forward. And the first one is sort of intuitive, and it's that really communities are committed to preserving the qualities that make them special, unique, and vital. That's their primary focus. And if we do have resistance to particularly affordable housing, we need to recognize that that's where that's coming from. Because the other piece that we need to keep in mind is that communities are willing to listen They're willing to listen to solutions that allow them to preserve just the qualities that I mentioned a second ago, because they're beginning to see a lot of the things that we are related to housing preference, demographics, and I think that they are beginning to think about the way that we approach development and specifically housing. So I think it's important to keep those two things in mind. Obviously, beyond that, there's some nuanced challenges in each community, rural, urban, and suburban. But I believe there are some universal issues that we, particularly as planners and certainly as citizens, elected officials, and interested parties need to keep in mind. We're dealing with an extremely low vacancy rate across the state of New Hampshire. It's exacerbated in some of our more urbanized counties, obviously. And as a result, there's a great push to make more housing stock available, referring to really all types of housing stock, which is important to keep part of the conversation as well. I think we've recognized that building out that would impact our natural resources adversely is not a priority for many of our communities, even those that are more urban, including here in the city of Nashua. And as a result, we need to really look towards more compact development patterns that align well with our more traditional New England style development. And the answer there gets to the magic word, and that is density. We've heard this a lot. It's almost a cliche within the conversation around affordable housing, but density really is one of the ways, it's one of the challenges, and it's one of the solutions to the affordable housing issue that we're facing here in the state of New Hampshire. And I think communities need to begin to look at how they can permit higher density development in the priority areas that they identify, not necessarily in all areas of the community, which I think is an important piece to keep in mind. I also would emphasize, though, that we've seen a lot in all communities that development costs are high. We hear often they aren't making any more land, and certainly they aren't making any more land in the areas that are priorities for development, which tend to be more of the sort of community core areas that both our empty nesters and our millennials, to Ryan's point, I hate to pigeonhole anybody, but those two demographic groups particularly are looking for. We don't have a lot of land availability, and the development cost is high in some of the more rural areas. And I'd also point out that the development cost is high for the developer, but the development cost is also high for the municipality moving forward. It's a lot of operations and maintenance associated with that development that we're seeing in our more rural areas. And ultimately, it will be the taxpayers of those communities that will bear the burden of keeping those developments salient moving forward. So I think it's critical to keep that in mind. One of the more obvious challenges I think that we've all seen, we've all dealt with over the last decades, is really just the conversation about affordable housing and workforce housing. I hesitate to use either of those terms, honestly, in this conversation, but I think we have to. I think it's incumbent upon us as housing advocates, and certainly folks who are interested in this issue, to talk about what creation of homes actually looks like, and not label it with any specific term. And I think it's important for us when we go into diverse communities to talk about housing in a context that they actually understand. We can't go into rural communities necessarily and talk about multifamily. We need to talk about other affordable housing options that might be more compatible with their vision for the community. I think many of the issues that we've been dealing with, particularly on the development side, and certainly on sort of the land use process side, were dealt with in HB 1629. I don't want to take anything away from what Representative Griffith will talk about in just a few minutes, but we were certainly disappointed to see that piece of legislation fail. And I believe if you look it up online, it says it's simply died, which is very sad death there. But we do hope that legislative package comes back, because it was the hard work of a lot of housing advocates to deal with a lot of the regulatory issues that we're seeing. Just a few quick other notes, I think, that are more specific on the challenge side. Many of you may be familiar with the accessory dwelling unit legislation that was put in place several years ago. It's been a piece of housing conversation in a lot of communities. I think we need to look critically at whether our communities have implemented that effectively, and whether there need to be additional changes made to that legislation, or at least at the local level within our communities. I think that's a real opportunity for us to create more housing with limited character impact to our communities. I also think that one of the problems with housing generally is it's sort of perceived to be an over there kind of issue. This has always come up as part of sort of the regional conversation, and certainly in working with communities, really at Strafford Regional Planning Commission, doing master planning, the conversation tended to change when we brought them unique data about their community. Understanding that it impacts them at a local level, and the diversity and the quality of life for their community, I think, is so critical. So to the extent that communities can actually invest some time and money in acquiring data that apply to them or a comparable community to them, I think it makes this conversation a lot more real, and allows them to confront what I think is a challenge that they may not even be aware of right now. But again, just to close out, circling back to those two values, I think we really need to convey, a value statement to a diverse set of communities. I think affordable housing or workforce housing means a different thing to every community. It's not a one size fits all element.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really sort of spoke to both the challenges and the possible solutions for these different communities. I want to pull that thread a little bit more about messaging and what you said about workforce housing and affordable housing as sort of terms. So I think whoever came up with the term workforce housing was totally spot on, brilliant. It's a perfect word, housing for members of the workforce, housing for the workforce, workforce housing. But it really has become sort of jargon. So how do you recommend, and what advice do you have as far as messaging and talking about this issue of workforce affordable housing?
I think it's a great question. And I think what's been attempted over the last decade particularly is to message this type of housing, and I prefer homes, quite honestly, because I think we associate that with single family dwelling units, but I refer to it as a home. I think we've tried to associate it with a specific sort of a demographic or subset of the population. And I think that was well done. We tend to associate it with nurses and teachers and this sort of person, that sort of person. But I actually would like to see the conversation shift a bit more towards the form of the development. I think that we need to tell the story of what this type of housing looks like through pictures, because I think that's the best way to convey, the message that we're trying to send. Certainly, it's important to understand who's going to live there, because certainly there's a stigma around the term housing, I think, generally. But if we show communities forms of development that are compatible with either what they look like or what they strive to look like, or what other communities in New Hampshire look like that they look to, I think we can really push the conversation forward.
We got a sort of question comment from Ben Frost from New Hampshire Housing. I'm sure most people know who that is, regarding your comments about the financial burden on municipalities. And so this question is about, shouldn't we be encouraging development that is more efficient? And Ben's thinking specifically of the work that was done by Urban 3 last week. So if folks don't know about Urban 3 and what New Hampshire Housing did, they contracted Urban 3 to look at doing some sort of land value analysis. What's our value per acre and how valuable is the development? And Matt, I know you were there for that webinar and have a copy of that report. Did you want to comment at all on that? Shouldn't we be encouraging more efficient development?
Yes, I think that's a great question and a simple answer, and I think Ben hit it right on the head in the chat. I would say absolutely, and I hope that my comments on really pushing towards more traditional compact development in our downtowns supports just that. I think we need to look really carefully at creation of roads and other infrastructure that us and our children will be responsible for paying for in the future. And again, I think it happens to line up quite well with some shifts in housing preference that we're seeing towards that downtown area where we can all access services that are so critical to our daily lives and experience a high quality of life. So yes, the answer is yes. That's the right way to move forward, I think.
Awesome. Matt, I'm going to give you a little bit of a break. Wilis, this next question is for you, because I know that you learned a lot about housing between now and when you joined the governor's task force on housing. Was it last year or the year before that? What happened in your first term in the House, and what can we expect from your second term?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me, Sarah. It was a very interesting term and a great learning experience. I do want to start off with a huge thank you to all the people on the panel for helping with both the advocacy and the legislation, as well as a number of people that I've seen in the attendees as well. So obviously Ben Frost, very central to that effort. So Noah Hodgetts in there as well from OSI. And of course, Alyssa Margolin from Housing Action New Hampshire, and really helping bring that coalition along and doing a ton of tremendous advocacy work. And I'm as disappointed, if not more disappointed, by the rather immediate death of those two bills because of the pandemic. And as disappointing as that was, we had some really incredible successes doing that work. Just to walk through what form that took a little bit was after that housing task force had come together and pulled together kind of a set of recommendations and some draft language around legislation. The governor's office invited 3 or 4 of us in to really help drive that legislation forward within the State House. But that role kind of took on an extra level of visiting regional planning commissions, talking to local elected leaders, talking to some of these other housing groups across the state, and facing a tremendous amount of pushback. and having some real hurdles to overcome and some difficult conversations, but really incorporated all of that feedback into a proposed amendment before it even reached the committee. And I'll have to say that housing is one of those issues that definitely does not fall on traditional political lines. So there's some really great coalitions built and some wonderful people brought in from outside of the normal process that really help facilitate this. And so by the time we got to the legislative process, we had a much, much improved bill that had a ton of community input, which was still pushed back very, very hard on by the members of first the municipal and county committee for good reason. And on both sides of that, we had Marjorie Porter and Clyde Carson on the Democrat side and Tom Dolan on the Republican side, really working to improve that bill, and credit to that committee for really putting both 1629 and 1632 where they ought to be before going to the Ways and Means Committee. So there were a lot of hands in the pot here, and a huge thank you to all those folks. And I'm sure everyone's as disappointed as I am that those got lost in the process. I know that there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment about what the next session will look like, with all of New Hampshire flipping and the governor maintaining the corner office. So there's a lot still to be determined politically and how that'll impact all of these things. One of those people that was so central to this work the first time around is John Formella, who's the legal counsel for Governor Sununu, and he's phenomenal at the work he does. And he's kind of let me know that it is of interest to the governor's office again, but they have a lot to figure out as well. And we're all trying to find our footing, and a big transition here in the state. But again, there are some tremendous people doing the work, and excited to get back to it this session. At the end of last session, we had HB 1247, which originally started off as Casey Conley's bill out of Dover. And that bill originally was a 90-day notice for any rent increases. And unfortunately, we lost that bill's substance as well. So that completely fell to the wayside, but we kept the sponsor and the number. And what it turned into was a very large housing omnibus bill that was targeted at mortgage defaults and non-payment of rent during COVID-19. And that really helped us understand kind of some of the housing responses. And there's a lot of advocacy again around that particular bill that passed both the House and the Senate in those final days at UNH during that session. Unfortunately, was vetoed by the governor. And I think that that was a big loss and very disappointing for everyone involved in the housing space. The justification, I believe, for his actions on that was that the CARES funding and some of the earmarking that was done for housing policy should have made up for that. I'm not sure that it entirely did, and wasn't as maybe proactive in moving the state forward. But that's kind of the wrap up, I think, from last session. Sarah, I'm happy to talk about specifics of those two bills if that would be helpful, or answer any other questions.
Yes, please. I think for folks in the audience who aren't familiar with what HB 1629 and 1632 did, if you would give a little summary about what those would have done if they had passed.
Absolutely. Well, 1629 was definitely the more regulatory bill, and 1632 is the more financial incentive driven bill. But overall, in taking them both together, we had outlined a housing champion program, which really addresses a lot of what Matt was talking about with the different needs of different communities, and understanding what Ryan was talking about in very diverse needs of diverse populations. And that housing champion program was ultimately paired with a bonding program that would have incentivized municipalities to offer some of these programs with the funds available, to kind of either mandate or incentivize training for local planning and zoning boards, as well as just kind of enable some further workforce housing changes. Some of the other technical changes within that language were regarding TIF districts and 7090 and the community revitalization. That piece and those two pieces were really what resonated most with communities, I believe. And that was where I heard the most positive feedback and was at the core of the bill. Beyond that, we did expand the definition of workforce housing, and that as well, even just in name, does a lot to move the conversation forward in the state. And as disappointed as we were and as scaled back as some of that bill had become over the process, was a great learning opportunity. And we got a lot of people on the same page, and hopefully we're able to kind of pick up where we left off, obviously with some much decreased state revenues to incentivize a lot of these programs this time around. And in a budget year, this is going to be a difficult conversation again, but really looking forward to helping drive this forward for the next couple of years.
Awesome. Because this event is in partnership with the Seacoast Chamber Alliance, we end up with a lot of, business folks and representatives from the business community in the audience. So, Wilis, what advice would you have for attendees who might be interested in following along with what happens in the legislative session? Sort of how do they stay sort of up to date on what you're doing and what the legislature is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Alyssa does a terrific job with Housing Action NH and their website, housingactionnh.org. And I believe she has a newsletter that goes out. Following along as best you can. It's not always the most transparent process at the State House, which is something I would love to have some help making a change on as well. But following either on Legiscan or GenCourt to see where those bills lie and actually being able to follow the exact text. But for those advocacy opportunities and best ways to plug into the process, I would say talk to all of us panelists, talk to Alyssa, talk to Ben. The other piece is because the Senate flipped, talk to your state senators. I think that that's the best place to start. There are an awful lot of state reps in New Hampshire. And while we all think we're very important, I would go the route of talking to the state senators, and they're going to have the best impact here. The final thing I would say is either volunteer or run to be on your local planning or zoning board. There's a need for people that are willing to engage and have these conversations. And it is difficult work, and I'm not on there, but I feel comfortable to say that it can be dry at times. But people are very, very much needed in those positions. And that's really the best way to get involved on the ground.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we got a note from Ben. He says, Representative Griffith, thanks so much for your leadership. He also said that there is a forthcoming final report. So I think the audience might be interested in knowing this, of SB 43, which was the Commission to Study Barriers to Increased Density of Land Development in New Hampshire. One of the recommendations will be to reintroduce the passage of 1629 and 1632, among other recommendations. So stay tuned for that report. I know certainly once it's out, we'll share it with our Facebook page and in our newsletter and on our website. So if folks are interested in learning more about what came out of that. So we do have some questions coming in from the audience, which is awesome. Please keep those coming. Attendees, put your questions in the Q&A if you're joining us on the webinar. And if you're joining us on Facebook, throw the questions in the comments because we do have somebody monitoring the comments there. Ryan, I'm going to circle back to you. So I'd be remiss not to mention the coronavirus. The theme of this year's summit, I said, was the future of housing. This was decided before the pandemic happened, but I think it's still apropos considering the precarious state that we're in right now. How is the coronavirus affecting the housing market, and what are you seeing right now?
If we were in a crisis last year, I don't know how we would even say what's going on right now. Inventory's down. In the report that you shared, it said 27%. The New Hampshire Association of Realtors had it actually up to 59.7% down, which has last year was like, we have no houses to sell. And this year it's just been even worse. And then we've had an influx of out-of-staters that are now working remote. They still have their jobs in Boston. We sold the house recently to somebody from DC that they're still employed in DC with a DC salary and coming into New Hampshire, and they're willing to pay either cash, waive inspections, waive appraisals, pay way over asking price. So if it was a tough market last year, it's become even tougher this year.
Yeah, certainly. And I think a lot of us have stories that are similar to that. I know someone who just moved up here with his Boston salary. He's paying something like $2,200 in his Portsmouth apartment, which is very much affordable to him because it's actually significantly less than he was paying in Boston. So certainly it's driving maybe a market for some like luxury housing, at least market rate housing. And I'm seeing communities who are making the case for developing more market rate and more luxury housing. Certainly in-migration is good. New Hampshire needs the young people in the state. We need members of the workforce, but where will they live? So Matt, speaking of the coronavirus, the housing crisis was accelerated by the pandemic, but COVID didn't cause it. From your perspective, did the pandemic change how communities are tackling housing affordability? What can communities be doing right now to strengthen their housing supply and strengthen their resiliency?
Yeah, well, I think, Sarah, it's pretty simple that it certainly didn't cause it, but it's made it more obvious, I think, to a lot of communities. Certainly, when I was leaving my role with the town of Wolfeboro, which is considered by most to be a very rural community, we had seen a huge influx of residents coming up, not only early for seasonal homes to stay permanently, but also folks actually moving up there into existing seasonal homes to remain permanently. And I think we're going to see that a lot in some of our more rural communities, where second homes are sort of the character of the community and may become the primary structure for a lot of folks. But I think in all of our communities, yeah, it's just shed more light on the issue. And it gets us to a point where we need to start thinking more readily about the solutions to a lot of these issues, I think. And, if I maybe you could just comment on a few of those, I think, which are not direct solutions, but I think that, obviously we need to, again, focus on the fact that, if we're going to build more housing, it's not just going to be single family development. It's not just going to be duplex development. It's not just going to be multifamily. It has to be a range. And it gets back to this idea of the fact that there isn't a universal preference for any demographic group. There's a mix of preferences in all groups. There's certainly a delay in some the millennial groups, I think, for home purchase, which is a critical piece. But I think it's that varied solution of housing type that's going to be so critical, and allowing for more dense development of it, again, is going to answer the affordability piece, I think. Again, emphasizing the fact that density is a sliding scale. It's going to be an incremental level of zoning adjustment that we need to do in communities, and the increment will depend on what the community is comfortable with. One example, obviously, is that in Wolfeboro, as a very technical thing, we allowed 6 units per acre in our downtown. If we were to have the density that Nashua allows in the downtown in Wolfeboro, the conversation would be over. Or if we were to suggest it, the conversation would be over. So how can we get the communities feeling comfortable with an incremental increase? And what I tried to do there is to, again, help them visualize an environment that they may be familiar with, whether it's in downtown Dover, perhaps in Concord. Getting them comfortable with the look and feel, I think, is so critical when we're talking about some of those more technical issues around density. We can't just go in, bull and china shop and prescribe 20 units per acre in some of these more rural or suburban communities. There's got to be a context sensitivity that we do it with. I know that Darren had asked a question in the chat. I'm not going to answer that directly because it's for Ryan, but I think talking to the development community is not a solution necessarily, but it's something that we just have to do. How can we possibly come up with solutions if we don't have a concrete understanding of what exactly the issues are? And that's why I was so impressed by the Housing Task Force work in 1629, because it did just that. It tried to turn attention to some of the flaws in our existing system rather than just complaining about it. And I think it was really solution driven. And I think we need to continue to do that. And it starts with talking to developers. They're the ones that are dealing with these issues. They're the ones that are doing the math to figure out whether development is viable. And we certainly don't want them to build housing that they can't maintain properly and is not financially viable. So that's, opening that conversation, I think, is critical. And certainly density is another piece of how it actually gets built. And again, I just encourage communities to audit their regulations. There are funding sources that are out there right now, the Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program. Certainly here in Nashua, we just completed a housing study that was a very self-critical look, I think, at a lot of our regulations and policies that are in place. Certainly that's fairly large in scope, but other communities, even those that are rural, do have the ability to do a regulatory audit of what they have in place and get an outside perspective on what is and what is not working in your community. And I feel that those studies tend to be context sensitive, again, in prescribing regulatory changes that would be comfortable for a community, because there certainly is not a one size fits all for every community. And just to, shamelessly plug in the way that Representative Griffith did, Joining a planning board is not the most exciting thing. Joining a zoning board is not the most exciting thing. There's no question about that, but it is literally the best way to get involved in these types of regulatory changes that I feel need to happen at the local level. HB 1629 was about local control. It will continue to be about local control and local choice. So be a part of that conversation. Write a letter to the planning board if you don't want to join the board and give up all of your Tuesday or Thursday or Wednesday evenings. But that's a really, really important place to inject yourself, I think, if you want to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, certainly. Matt and I both recently left. I was serving on Durham's planning board. I moved to Newmarket and had to leave the planning board. Matt was serving on Dover's planning board and had a conflict and had to leave the planning board. So either Matt or I are great people to talk to if you want to talk about joining your planning board. We'll just tell you absolutely everything that you need to know. I want to circle back and just emphasize your point about that your ordinance has to work. And if you don't have a conversation with your developer, then you don't know the answer to the question, does it work? And so often when I talk to communities that have a workforce housing ordinance, that's my follow-up question is, does that ordinance work? Is it financially feasible? Because if it's not, then no developer is ever going to use it. And so certainly that's something that the coalitions can help with, that New Hampshire Housing can help with, that a municipal technical assistance grant can help with, is answering that question of, does it work? Is it possible to build it in a, and of course that's the point of the workforce housing laws, not that you have to build workforce housing, but that it has to be possible. There has to be an opportunity, a reasonable and realistic opportunity to develop, meaning that it has to be financially feasible to a developer to do it. Otherwise it'll never get done.
So Sarah, if I could just quickly comment on that, I think a great example that I've seen, sorry to jump in, but I can't tell you the number of communities that I've worked with that have looked at both their inclusionary zoning, which is sort of a technical piece of zoning, and their conservation subdivision ordinances even, and said, we wrote this thing 10 years ago and it's not working. We want to fix it. So there's certainly an interest in doing that. And again, there are assistance programs out there. And if those two terms sound familiar to you, you're not alone. This is something that many communities are dealing with right now.
That's fantastic. We have a couple questions from our audience. So Ryan, this one is for you. How willing do you think developers are to build workforce housing versus market rate if communities can incentivize it through zoning, density, height, parking, etc.?
I think that they'd be willing, but the key is that the community truly has to understand what workforce housing is and how that's a benefit to their community. So the planning board can make the zoning within the planning board, they can change the zoning, but if the community doesn't understand how that's going to benefit the community, then we're going to have an issue. So I think we need to just understand that coronavirus actually helped us understand more that workforce housing is the place where our grocery store people work, the essential workers, our healthcare professionals, our teachers, everybody that's kind of on the front line of this pandemic right now is our workforce. So if we can kind of connect, it's an emotional connection, I think, instead of thinking that these people need to go live I've actually heard this in Amherst, those people should go live in Merrimack by the apartments by the highway. And then instead realize, like, actually we want these people in our community because they make our community a vibrant, healthy place. So it's not, I think zoning is definitely the step, but we need way more education that workforce housing makes our communities better, not it doesn't degrade them.
Certainly, yeah. There are certainly, so I'll add a little bit, there are certainly developers who that's what they do. They build workforce housing or affordable housing. There are developers who do it because they genuinely care about the community. Those might be a little more rare, but there are developers out there who love the community so much that they want to build something that works. And there's a developer in Durham who comes to mind who really would like to see the downtown, which is, primarily, it's a university community, of course, but there are adults who live there and there are year-round residents. And so he'd like to see, and he's developing specifically because he'd like to see the adults recolonize that downtown and support those downtown businesses and make it a place for the entire community, not just the college students. So, but certainly the other developers, the vast majority of them don't fit into those two boxes. And those are folks who will they'll build whatever works. And a lot of times, I think, so we spend a lot of time talking about regulations and zoning. We don't spend as much time talking about the process. And so I know developers, and I've heard this comment before, that they go wherever there is sort of the path of least resistance. So they're not going to develop in a community where it's going to take 18 months to get through the planning board and be just sort of an exhausting long process, because time is money. And they're more likely to develop in, say, a community like Dover, which has made that process clear. There's a lot of clarity in Dover's approval process and in their zoning regulations, and they've made it easier for developers to get through that process and made it more rapid. So we have another.
I was going to say exactly. I think people forget that developers have to front the bill whether or not their project is approved. So
Right.
they always put this like negative light on developers that they're just making all this money, but they have to spend sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars before anything, the ground is even broken. And if the community makes it really difficult, that's money that's just lost.
Right. And if they end up with a no, then it's truly just money that's lost. And yeah, absolutely. And Ryan, while I have you here, I know there's another question that you wanted to add something to. So we have a question from the audience. Is there more that can be done with local regional employers, larger and smaller, to press for more housing stock and connect it to the regional local economy? And that's a great question, because the voice of the business community is a really powerful one.
Yes, so the business community by far, I know the BIA, and then also I've been on the advocacy committee for the New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility for several years. I would say it's a little bit of an echo chamber. We need more housing to house our employees. So within the New Hampshire Businesses of Social Responsibility, over the last several years, we've drafted these sensible housing principles, and our goal is to get at least 100 businesses to sign on. So legislators like Wilis can show up and say, hey, the business community is supporting legislation that is open zoning for density and incentivizes all the things that we're talking about, because housing is so critical to our businesses' success and our communities being vibrant places to live. So you can go to the website, it's very easy to find it. But if you are an employee of a business that cares about housing, signing on to those principles is a great first step. And then following everything that Matt and Willis had said, follow legislation and just show up and be involved.
Great. Matt and Willis, is there anything you'd like to add to that one, particularly thinking about sort of being on a planning board or being a state representative and hearing from the business community? How important and how influential is that in your decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. We had Taylor Caswell, head of the BEA, as a pretty core member of that task force with the governor's office, and he's done a great job in pushing that economic development. I think both on this issue and a number of others, I saw living wage pop up. We have paid family leave. There's a lot of things that will contribute to a better environment and culture in the state that really need to come from pressure from the business community. And some of that is having conversations where possible. I know for me, coming from the west side of Manchester and where I represent, we have Catholic Medical Center, which has just undergone a big expansion and really taking over a couple of blocks there. And we have SNU, who is spilling over onto the west side as well and has quite a bit of space and a ton of employees in and around Manchester. And so pushing and trying to meet with these businesses and organizations and large nonprofits and pushing them to take a more active role in the housing space is something that we also need to emphasize. That paying their employees well is obviously a very good starting point, but contributing to the community on a larger scale, and that's transit and transportation and making places walkable and creating safe, livable communities. And really factoring in housing to those conversations and getting in a room with those folks is incredibly important, and something that I don't think has been done particularly well yet. I know the BIA does some great work, but we haven't really seen them step up and lead on the housing spot yet. So that would be my challenge to them, I think, is really to step up and play a big role here. I know that they do summits and they do some work as well. But would love to see them calling on individual businesses to support this effort.
Yeah, I love that you sort of also answered that question about wages, minimum wage and living wage, because one of the things that I love about housing is that it's connected to everything. And so, yes, this question of sort of wages comes up a lot. Matt, is there anything you'd like to add in regard to the impact that the business voice has at the local level when you're on the planning board? How much do you love to hear from sort of the business community coming in and making their case for more housing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and the answer is that we really don't see a lot of it. Honestly, I think that's a huge issue. We're starting to see, particularly in Dover, some actual sort of employee sponsored housing from the employer itself, which I think is fantastic. That's something that hasn't been done a whole heck of a lot in New Hampshire, and it's starting to come back a bit. But even on our ordinary development applications, how fantastic would it be to see an abutter speak and then against the project, and then have a letter from a business that supports the project in front of the board right after. We don't see a lot of that, unfortunately. And I think that to the extent that a private industry can be a part of that conversation, be either monitoring what's going on at the local development level, or perhaps the community can establish a relationship with the existing business community to get their input on these larger development projects that might provide housing. I think it would be great to have them be a voice in the conversation. I can't even think in the last year of a time that I've seen a private business not directly associated with the project come forward to a meeting and actually speak in support. And I'm just thinking about it, it brings a smile to my face. How fantastic would that be? So I'd encourage all of the folks on the webinar today to do just that. Please do be connected, and hopefully your local municipality will also reach out to you and ask you to be a part of that conversation. I think it would even be worth our local community sponsoring forums to actually engage the business community about just this, and establishing a more permanent conduit moving forward.
Certainly. So I'm going to ask a little bit about the barriers to advocacy, because my experience on the planning board was that it becomes a sort of, it's physically exhausting because it usually runs late into the night. I've had planning board meetings go until 11:30 or midnight, but it's also emotionally exhausting to hear a lot of negativity, and there aren't a lot of folks who come to the planning board to speak in support of something. Usually it's the other side of that. So I'm going to start with you, Wilis. What are some of those barriers to advocating, whether we're at the local level in the planning board or at the state level, and how can we start to address some of that so that we can get folks who are interested in being advocates, they are advocating?
Absolutely. I'll speak to the state level and leave kind of the local for Matt and Ryan and yourself. At the state level is very difficult. As you've said, there is a real lack of transparency around the process and difficulty to engage, even more so now with the pandemic. And we'll see how all of that shifts moving forward. Legislation that I sponsored last term and will need to come back this term is making it more accessible and using remote testimony and finding ways to engage folks from all the different areas in the state. That's a real hurdle right now, especially when all of those hearings are in the middle of the day, when folks that most likely would benefit from exactly this type of legislation are working or taking care of their family. So that process is difficult to engage. Again, I think Housing Action New Hampshire is the best state level way to get involved in that advocacy. Calling your local reps, senators, call the governor's office and really bug them about it is also the best way to engage, and just asking questions of what are you doing to further workforce housing efforts in the state and making it part of the conversation. It, I think, was part of the conversation last year because we had this package of bills. Hopefully it continues that way. And COVID, again, didn't create these problems. We knew that they were there before and just exacerbated them. But hopefully at least it means it stays in the spotlight of the conversation moving forward. So at the state level, again, Housing Action, the House calendar is dense and difficult to read, but even just trying to find what housing related bills are coming up on a week-to-week basis and calling the folks involved with them, whether it's committees or your local reps or otherwise, is the best way to engage.
Absolutely. The Workforce Housing Coalition has done a lot of work on this kind of particular topic over the last few years, more than before. We've always been an advocacy organization, but usually it was us doing the advocacy, and we sort of turned our attention a little bit to training people to do advocacy and addressing some of the barriers. So I dropped a link in the chat for everyone to check out. It is the Advocacy 101 tab on our website, has some resources for how to be a good advocate, what are some best practices for advocacy, and advice from actual state representatives and local board members like Representative Griffith and Matt Sullivan, for potential advocates. Ryan, what would you add at the local level? What are some of the barriers to advocacy, and how can we address those?
I feel like I'll say similar things. I think it's just overwhelming. I personally feel like I'm very involved, but it's still very overwhelming because there's so much to learn and you don't understand the process. And you can, like, you see a bill, the beginning of a bill, and then all of a sudden it goes through all these committees, and then it comes back as something else. And you're like, well, what happened there? And then how do I get involved? So it is a difficult process, but I think you just need to show up and realize you're going to learn as you go, and decide where, like, maybe it's just in your town, or if there's an organization that's more of a regional organization. Just get involved and volunteer, get on the committee and show up week after week after week. And eventually you're going to start to understand the process and know where your voice is best used to serve the mission forward.
That's great. Yeah. Matt, I don't know who to throw this question to, so I'm gonna throw it to you. So we have a comment from the audience. So from Michelle Talwani of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. So one thing that has not been talked about in this conversation is manufactured housing, which is certainly a solution to the affordable housing crisis. So she writes, there are 300 vacant lots and resident-owned manufactured home communities through New Hampshire. It's a great option for families at a fraction of the cost of stick-built housing and without the barrier of permits and approvals. So vacant lots and manufactured housing parks are ready to have a home size and without the administrative setup. So how would you respond to that? Have you seen success with manufactured housing?
So I have, and I think it's actually a great point, and thank you for raising it. It again comes back to this conversation about form, though. I think we've seen the quality and appearance of a lot of manufactured housing improve over recent years. It's something that I dealt with in Wolfeboro, where we saw an increased push to install manufactured housing units on vacant parcels of land, both in and outside of parks, and generally there tended to be a resistance to that approach. But once we had an actual visual of what that housing looked like, and I would just note for the record that many of the $10 million homes that are built in Wolfeboro are also built out of sort of manufactured housing units that are built into one piece. So I think we need to change how we think about that type of housing. We have a lot of it out there that we aren't aware of. But getting to the idea of something that's built in a factory that can be moved, saves a lot of the development cost, I think the answer is we absolutely should look at whether or not what are often very restrictive manufactured housing regulations in communities, whether those are the right thing and whether they should be something that should be broadened, like accessory dwelling units, to be allowed more broadly. I would also just note a specific item related to this. One thing that we were very successful with in Wolfeboro is allowing simply duplex units by right in all of our residential districts. It's something that not a lot of communities do because it is increased density, but it's something that, if done properly, doesn't really impact the character of the neighborhood and can really fit in some units sort of silently in a lot of areas and quite easily. And relatively speaking, the regulatory changes needed to make that were well received by the community. And I'd encourage a lot of communities to look at that as a long-term solution that may not be as high of a barrier to clear when implementing at the local level. But manufactured housing is definitely a solution. It's something that I think we need to make sure our regulations are at least accommodating of moving forward.
Yeah, and I'm sure Michelle would be happy to talk to folks who are interested in this topic and would like to talk more about it. So reach out to the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund if you want to talk more about manufactured housing. They are the experts on this topic. We're still looking for more questions from our audience. So is there anything you want to know? Drop your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to plug a couple of things. The first is communities and consequences. If you don't know, this was a documentary and a book that came out in 2008. The sequel, Communities and Consequences 2, which is the rebalancing of New Hampshire's human ecology, is now available. You can watch the documentary online. There's a link to it on our website, and you can buy the book at a local bookstore near you. So I know that you can buy it at River Run in Portsmouth and at Water Street Books. That's where I bought my copy in Exeter. So check this out. This has a whole chapter on age-restricted housing. There's a lot of conversation in here about children and property taxes and school enrollment and that topic. And there's a whole chapter here too on sort of what businesses are doing. And they highlight Dartmouth Hitchcock and how they're dealing with the workforce shortages. A more sort of Seacoast example would be Harmony Homes. You may know about the cottage cluster development that is being proposed in Dover. This is specifically because Harmony Homes, which has approval to build another building, has such a hard time with staffing that they have not been able to. I mean, they were having this struggle with staffing. They gave back to this question about sort of living wage and minimum wage, they gave all of their employees a huge raise so that they would be able to afford housing in this area. They still were having a hard time with staffing because of the lack of housing supply. So they decided to build their own housing. They have approval already for a small apartment building that's right on the Harmony Homes site, Harmony Homes by the Bay in Durham. And there's going to be a childcare facility there too. So businesses are responding to this housing crisis by sort of giving up on the communities and developers to build the housing and building it themselves, which I think speaks volumes about where we're at on this. The author of this book, Peter Francesi, is going to be speaking at our annual meeting, which is on Tuesday, December 1st from 4 to 5:30. He'll be joined by Dr. Richard England, who did a study with the New Hampshire Association of Realtors. The title of that study is, Will More Children Increase My Property Taxes? So that should be a really interesting discussion and talking about sort of age-restricted housing, how age-restricted housing started, and this sort of myth about children and property taxes. And perhaps if we have time, I'll circle back to that and have our attendees respond to that topic. So let's see. We have some questions in here. Okay, so wondering what the thoughts of the group are in regards to the need for affordable workforce housing in town city centers when the market is supporting more expensive luxury homes. So what can be done on the local level to help encourage less luxury style housing? And I'm going to throw this one to Matt first, because I think Dover is an interesting example of this as a good mix of affordable and workforce housing, but is also building a lot of luxury and market rate housing right now.
Yeah, Sarah, I think it's actually a relatively brief answer. I think what communities really need to focus on, particularly where the development trend is towards more high-end units, is to be offering density incentives basically to developers. Again, we commonly refer to this as inclusionary zoning, but what we would functionally do is offer the ability to provide more or build more units in a specific area. And by offering that bonus, we would actually restrict the affordability of some of the units within the development. And that's been done very effectively in many communities. It's certainly something that's been done in Dover, but it's a great solution that I think we need to look at our model communities and particularly in some of the more suburban communities where this may be possible in the city area or downtown area. I think it may be a viable solution there. It reminds me of, in some senses, form-based code, which is really a form of zoning that relies on the look and feel of a specific building or a use, in that it was believed to be almost incompatible, I think, in the state of New Hampshire and a lot of our more rural communities, but it's actually been implemented effectively, and I think we're getting a lot of positive results out of it. And similarly, I think inclusionary zoning has been around for a long time, has been implemented with mixed results, but some communities are beginning to sort of tip the scale on that. And I think we need to look to them to amend our own regulations to allow for more of that type of zoning.
Awesome. Ryan, I'm going to throw this question to you. This is one of my favorite topics ever. And in fact, I just dropped a link to a blog post that I wrote for Stay Work Play in answering the question. With retail going under and offices going remote, is there any movement to convert vacant commercial to residential? This is something I've had a conversation with in Newington about several times, about sort of the Fox Run Mall, which if you've been in it recently, looks a little bleak. And so it would be great to see it converted into something else and revitalize that area. Do you have any thoughts on sort of maybe what's happening in the Concord area? Is there any thoughts on renovating or rehabbing, doing some reuse of commercial spaces?
I know it's talked about, but nothing is in the work. So it's definitely a conversation, but I'd say on the spectrum of an idea to execution, we're still in this brainstorming idea stage. But it's definitely something that I think we do need to start looking at, because we just have these spaces that are vacant, and then we need to figure out what to do with them. And as we move into 2021, I know that the commercial real estate market is going to keep taking a hit. So what are we going to do with these spaces if they're just sitting empty? So I would say it's a discussion, but I haven't seen anything, at least in the Concord area, that is like, this is a project that's moving forward. And if somebody has, please let me know.
Yeah, certainly it's something I'd love to see. Somebody dropped in the chat that Chinberg has talked about this being the next movement, and I have a quote from him in my blog post. He said, "The malls are the mills of the future," and so if Chinberg were able to revitalize the malls the same way he revitalized the mills, that'd be pretty amazing. I know that Portsmouth has rezoned some of their commercial strips, sort of where the Market Basket and the Kmart is, for people who are familiar with that area, and turned that into mixed use and included some inclusionary zoning so that there's some affordable or workforce housing as part of any future redevelopment, but nothing's happened yet. And part of my sort of excitement with Newmarket and my wanting to see this happen is because of Gosling Meadows. For folks who are familiar with the Portsmouth area, Gosling Meadows is a Portsmouth Housing Authority owned property that's kind of right smack dab in the middle there. So it has the mall on one side and Keys on another side and commercial on the other side. So there's some housing that's all alone, circled by a commercial area, and it would be great to see that be incorporated into more of a neighborhood versus a housing development as part of a greater area. Let's see. Wilis, I don't know if you've been following this topic of tiny homes, but we have a question in the Q&A if there's any progress on tiny homes. And I suspect Ben Frost probably knows the answer to this, so he might chime in the chat if you don't.
I hope Ben does chime in as well. I just threw in the bill docket for SB 482, which was the tiny home bill in the Senate this year, which was laid on the table. And that would be kind of the regulatory definitions, what exactly a tiny home is in New Hampshire. It's not a topic I'm particularly familiar with. So I did share that so folks can look at what that bill text was. My understanding is that doesn't exist currently, but I hope someone is able to chime into the chat. Again, that's something that is another housing option and choice that provides some more stock in the state and will likely have to come back up for new legislation this year.
Yeah, yep. So we'll see what happens with that. We do have another question from somebody in the audience. So we're talking about, Matt referred to the lack of available land, and that's certainly true. And to some extent, it's largely based on what local regulations allow. And so actually, this was something I meant to follow back to, is Matt used the term incremental a few times in talking about incremental development. Is there an opportunity to turn some of these larger single family homes into multifamily units? And are you hearing communities talking about this? Matt, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, and the answer is yes, and that gets to that duplex reference that I made before. Conversion to duplex in an existing single family home, by right as we call it, is something that I think we are starting to see communities do. It's something that I've had some preliminary conversation with some folks in the Seacoast on the planner side of things about, and it's something that we were really effective with in Wolfeboro. And again, I'd emphasize that the fear was that it would modify the character of a lot of these traditionally single family home neighborhoods. But I will say that in the many projects that we had, I received but few complaints as part of that process. So I think it's something that's being done. I have not heard of conversion to 3 family in single family development zones, but I think, again, looking at this as an incremental process, I see no reason that we should start with 2. And if we have limited impact, let's think about doing 3. I think that's a real opportunity that we will have, particularly with a lot of these large, 3,000 square foot homes that we have existing in more rural areas. They present a real opportunity in that regard.
Yeah, certainly. I dropped a link in the chat to a post that I wrote about a story map that Exeter did. So the blog post is called "A Map That Tells a Story." I wrote this for Stay Work Play, and what Exeter did was highlight some of the beautiful examples of former single-family homes that are now multifamily homes. And the great thing about this conversion of these sort of like older New England style, beautiful but too large houses is that they look gorgeous from the outside and they fit into the character of the neighborhood. So just because there's 3 families living there instead of 1 or 2 or however many, that they're still going to look wonderful from the outside and they fit the character of that neighborhood. So that's a great benefit there. So Ben did respond a little bit to the tiny house topic. Let's see what Ben said.
I was going to jump in and say just what Ben had said, actually, and that is that we just need to be careful when we're talking about tiny houses, that there's a very clear distinction between tiny houses on wheels and small homes, right? So, we have minimum requirements under the building code, obviously, and some municipalities have specific regulations, but the legislation that Representative Griffith referred to did have a tiny house on wheels component, which I understand to be much more controversial, but in many communities, you are permitted today to build a very small home. It then comes back to that minimum lot size and density conversation that we're talking about before. That's where the impediment really is, not necessarily on the size of the house itself.
Yeah, certainly that's a great distinction there. And going back to the example that I mentioned in Dover, that cottage cluster development, those are very small homes, but they're not called tiny homes because they're not tiny homes on wheels. So that's a great distinction. So it looks like we don't have any open questions from our audience. I always love to, so our annual summit is meant to be a solutions-oriented event that spurs action. So let's leave the attendees with a call to action. Representative Griffith, I'm going to start with you. What can our attendees do today if they're feeling inspired to make a difference?
Absolutely. I think I'll go right back to what I was saying before, is reach out to your local towns and communities and figure out what the process exactly is for joining those zoning and planning boards. I think that should be the #1 thing for everyone. And I would follow that up, that if you don't know who your state reps or senators are, both identifying those folks and reaching out. For me personally, we don't hear a lot from constituents, which is a disappointing part of the process, and identifying yourself and making known that workforce housing and housing availability and affordability is a priority for you and the rest of the community is something that we need to hear, and goes a long way, especially with the change of control and makeup of the House, Senate, and Executive Council. We really need to hear from you, and reaching out to your reps and senators, and then of course getting on the planning and zoning board are the big 2 things.
Absolutely. Ryan, what advice would you leave attendees with today?
Definitely everything Wilis said. One other thing I would say maybe joining the planning board or zoning board seems a little bit overwhelming. Figure out who's on those boards and make friends with them and ask them, hey, is any housing developments coming up that you think deal with affordable and workforce housing that needs support? And just showing up and support, writing a letter, following your representatives and senators on Facebook, seeing what they're posting. Like maybe your first step is just being an observer until you feel confident to engage. And then I would also look at like what your local chamber is doing, what any organization like your organization, Sarah, is doing, and then just be involved. And maybe it's not a huge commitment like joining the board, but just start being engaged.
Yeah, that's great. And Matt, what can attendees do today?
Well, I think the other 2 panelists have covered it quite well. I would just encourage, assuming that a lot of our attendees are business representatives, I would encourage them as representatives of private industry to play an active role in the conversation around housing and even the regulatory process involved with housing. We understand that not every employer can build housing for their employees, but being an advocate for the projects that might, I think is a critical piece that you can play a role in. Certainly, I think joining a board it's a high barrier to entry. I think Ryan makes a great point there. But I'd encourage anybody that's on the webinar today to check out the resources that the coalition has, to look at the resources that New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority has. Someone referenced the Urban 3 presentation in the chat. Whether you're a housing person or not, that is just a fascinating presentation. So you can get connected to a lot of these housing-focused conversations, and you may find that it interests you further, and then you may choose to play a more active role. But I would just encourage anybody on to continue to be an active part of this conversation. And thank you for your attendance today. And please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us as panelists for follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll make sure our attendees have your contact information so that they can do exactly that. I've plugged a lot of things today. I'm going to plug 2 more. I dropped a link for the Business and Industry Association's forum on workforce housing, which is next Thursday. You can register for that online. If you are a member of the Workforce Housing Coalition, your registration to that event is free. If you are not a member, you can certainly become one. I would also plug, so one of the things that the Workforce Housing Coalition has begun to offer is advocacy trainings. So quite literally taking folks who are interested in being part of the solution and interested in being advocates, but don't have any experience or comfort with that local government process, and training them on how to be an advocate and what those best practices are for advocacy and how the local government process works. So if that's something that your organization or your company or your sort of group of friends would like to do, that's something that we can offer. Of course, those are virtual right now, and there's been such great discussion today in the chat and in the Q&A and wonderful questions from the audience that I wish that we were in person so that we could really get into this lively discussion. But so those are a couple of more things that you could do today. I want to say thank you so much to our panelists. This is a very brilliant panel, and I'm thrilled that you all said yes to be part of this. So that's Matt Sullivan, Ryan Hvizda, and Wilis Griffith. And to our event partners, of course, the Seacoast Chamber Alliance and the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. Today's webinar was recorded, so you will be able to watch it again. You can tune in and see if there's anything that you missed. You can share it with a friend, or please, if you're so inclined, share it with your town's planning board or town or city council and make them watch it. We'll get that link to you soon. It looks like we have one more question that just came in, and we do have a little bit of time left, so let's see what that is. Oh, this is just a link to the Mini Cozy event. So if you wanted to watch and see what this Urban 3 thing is all about, you'll be able to do that. And again, I want to say thank you to our presenting sponsor, Cambridge Trust. I know we have some folks in the audience from Cambridge Trust. Thank you so much for your support of this event and for all of our work. And thank you all, of course, for attending this morning. We'll get the contact information from you, so you'll be able to ask questions of any of us. Please reach out anytime. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.